Big Consulting knows how to jump in front of the technology hype parades. Here's how they do it and why it's fooling the Global 2000 enterprises. Welcome to Dave is Not AI. I'm Dave, AI expert and AI skeptic. Let's get started. Navigating technology hype cycles requires not just staying informed, but sometimes capitalizing on perceptions, even if the substance isn't quite there. And while industry best practices focus on strategic alignment and measurable value, less ethical players have found ways to manufacture demand and project a sense of inevitability around the emerging technologies like generative AI and agentic AI. So I got to be a bit careful here because obviously I'm talking about in generalities. I'm not talking about people I've worked for in the past and things like that. But it's really kind of something I've seen going on for, pretty much all my career. In other words, if a hype cycle is starting to occur, people are talking about a technology trend. Many organizations, specifically big consulting organizations, make it an art form in terms of how they jump in front of the parades. And someone told me that one time and it always stuck with me. In other words, I asked a partner at a big consulting firm, this is many years ago, what you do. And he said, I find parades and jump in front of them. And that hit me, as a reality is at the end of the day, they're not necessarily creating the trends, but they're spotting trends that are occurring in the space, in this case, technological space. It could be client server, rise of the internet, service-oriented architecture, EAI, which obviously had a huge hand in, and now cloud computing, now AI, blockchain, metaverse, things like that. And figure out not only how to jump in front of the parades, but manipulate them. In other words, create them in your own way of thinking so that you have clients follow you, which is what the big consulting firms are looking to do because that's how they make money. So it's kind of an art form, and I figured I'd kind of break it apart for you in terms of what I know and how it happens out there so you can understand where the information's coming from, what it means, and make your own decisions around it. So the first rule is that they aggressively monitor trends and latch onto emerging tech, regardless of maturity, to signal visionary leadership. So AI is probably a good example of that, and certainly agentic AI, recently. So in other words, they see a rise in the trends around a particular, technology discipline, and that occurs in the zeitgeist, in other words, out there in public. And they go, okay, well, I've seen that more than 3 or 4 times in the same day. This may be something to it. And they figure out and strategize, as to whether or not it's a trend or not that's going to reap rewards. In other words, they're going to get some kind of revenue out of this trend. And then they start aligning some marketing dollars. They start aligning messaging. They start aligning some of the thought leadership work that they're doing. In other words, spending real money on creating the image or creating the perception that not only are they leading the space, but they were the innovators in the space when that typically wasn't true. So very few times I think the big consulting firms have kind of innovated in the space. In other words, creating, net new tech trends, so to speak. Those typically come from other areas, certainly universities and, some of the startups out there that are, a little bit more risk takers. And then once they created, the larger players, including the technology companies and certainly the big consulting companies, adopt it as their own, claim ownership of it, and make it seem like that's going to be so. And they're really good at it. And I've watched, and of course I participated in these kinds of activities over the years. I was kind of, taken back by how effective they are. But also I understand that they may be misleading sometimes in you're assuming that a particular organization was the net new innovators of a particular technology discipline when that wasn't the case. So the first step, once they decide that they're going to go after a particular technology space, like agentic AI, generative AI, everything we talked about earlier, cloud computing for sure, they commission and publicize bias surveys and inflate potential demand, creating the illusion of widespread necessity. And we've seen this huge amounts over the last 2 or 3 years, certainly the rise of generative AI. These surveys, every week there'll be a survey that pops up that talks about how enterprises are adopting generative AI at a massive scale and agentic AI at a massive scale. We had one big consulting firm said that, they have 12, I believe it's 12,000 agents that are running in their clients these days. All this stuff, which really kind of gets people to think that there's a big technology party going on and they weren't invited. And they have a tendency to be biased because they're not produced by independent or objective third parties. They're produced by consultants that are obviously going to benefit from the rise of this technology trend. Certainly if they're investing in building a practice and a discipline around it, which is perfectly fine. So it's a way of marketing. I get a little impatient when these things become a little too biased and a little too leading one way or the other. You can kind of tell it was, pay to play kind of scenario with some of these analyst firms out there and some of these survey organizations that really kind of come up with the answers that these consulting firms or even the technology firms are seeking. And therefore, they're a bit misleading. And I see them all the time. And I use some of them in my writings in my InfoWorld blog and, certainly here on the channel, but in many cases, if it seems way off, not only not use it, but in many cases, when I do use some of the material, I'll call out and I said, by the way, these aren't an objective third party. These guys are going to make a lot of money if this technology, takes off. So consider that, in the results of it. And that's what you need to do, because I think you have to look at what is the motivation of this organization in producing these particular survey results, certainly if they're very positive around the adoption of a particular kind of technology that they're promoting. And you'll notice too, for example, the security technology companies that sponsor a great deal of these surveys, they're never going to come out with the result that, people, enterprises are finding security not that big of a deal. It's always going to be huge amounts of concern and huge amounts of spending that needs to occur. We're not, at the level of security that we need to be to adopt AI or to adopt agentic or whatever. And it's always going to be bent in those directions. I think most people understand that. However, there's some enterprises out there that I do know that are making decisions based on some of this survey data. And when I'm working with them, I just say, remind them, because I wasn't there. I don't know if the survey was truly biased or not, but you kind of have to consider the source in terms of them coming to conclusions that you're aligning behind, because those conclusions may not in turn be accurate. And so it's buyer beware with that kind of stuff. And now we're spending huge amounts of marketing dollars, certainly after the agentic stuff. And the number of surveys and the amount of information that's out there is unprecedented now. And so you have to figure out how to sift through it and figure out what's accurate and what's not. So next would be to exaggerate claims about current adoption among your clients and partners to suggest that you and they are ahead of the curve. Obviously, with the agentic stuff, this is the best example of that I've seen in my career. In other words, the bragging that's going on in terms of how people are leveraging agentic AI and AI agents out there, certainly with the big consulting firms, is at an unprecedented level. But the actual work that's being done within the enterprise doesn't seem to bear that out. So I'm not seeing the adoption of agentic AI within the enterprises, the Global 2000 companies, as much to keep up with the way the perception is being formed, out there with some of these, some of these claims that are around there. For example, we mentioned earlier, some consulting firms said they're, building and running, 12,000 agents within their organizations. I don't know how that breaks apart, but I guarantee you, if you look at what agentic AI is as an architecture, and I know it well, I have one of the best-selling agentic AI courses now on LinkedIn Learning, and I did that many years ago. The reality is that agentic AI is a very niche technology that should only be used in particular niche problem domains. And it's very difficult for me to understand and believe that they're applying it in that many places, that it's had that much adoption yet. Now, I can't prove it, but I just have anecdotal information of actually what's going on out there versus what people are saying. And there seems to be a huge gap right now. And eventually, I think people are going to figure it out. We saw this, by the way, with the adoption of cloud, the adoption of client server, the adoption of service-oriented architecture, all these sorts of things. We had these huge claims by these consulting organizations and technology organizations that it was way further along than it actually was. And so now eventually what they're doing is they're hyping it up because they figure that it's going to create demand. demand's going to follow the hype and they're going to get the sales out of that. Sometimes that worked out, sometimes it didn't. And if it didn't work out, lots of people were embarrassed. So the next step normally is to flood your channels with case studies, real hypothetical, that showcase remarkable value and disruption. We're seeing case studies that are starting to emerge these days, but many of them really are much fewer than I think we thought we would, and certainly the maturation of generative AI and agentic AI. And that's because many of the enterprises out there, and this is kind of a well-kept secret, are moving with baby steps with AI. And that's because it's very expensive, it's very disruptive, they don't have the talent in-house yet, and they don't have the money to spend to make it happen. And so anything that looks like a success story is going to be exaggerated. They're going to give away free consulting, give away free technology with companies out there that are willing to help them produce case studies after the projects are complete. And we're seeing many of these things that are out there right now. And by the way, not disagreeing that there's case studies that show the use case for generative AI or agentic AI, what have you. But when you peel the onion, they're not doing that much. In other words, they're not very impressive as to how they're carrying stuff out. And that's because there are enterprises out there starting out slow to go faster. They can't spend a lot of money. They don't have a lot of talent in-house, everything I just talked about. And so they're going to be taking incremental steps, which are not necessarily going to be impressive use cases or business cases out there. And so you're seeing a lot of excitement and hype around particular case studies that turned out to be really non-impressive. And also in many instances, they're not a good application of AI. In other words, they're using a problem and force-fitting AI, generative AI or agentic AI or traditional machine learning, what have you, to solve the issue when it really didn't need it, which means they're spending 10 times the amount of money to solve the same issue, which is something I don't think enterprises should do. You're just burning money if you're doing that. So next would be pushing rapid pilots or proof of concepts, prioritizing speed and hype over substance or sustainable value. We're seeing this in the fact that they're having these get to AI quick, kind of approaches out there. Frameworks, they could be technology stacks where they're aligning with different partners, and NVIDIA typically, and other, some of the AI leaders, OpenAI, Google, Microsoft, what have you. Excuse me. And they're coming up with, some kind of a pilot or a proof of concept around this framework or technology stack. Those are dangerous because if you have a technology stack and you're looking for a problem, that tells me you're going to create an inefficient architecture because you've already pre-built in your mind the solution to the problem when you don't understand what the problem is. And we've seen this for years. By the way, it happened, certainly in the early development stages and some of the object-oriented stuff, if you guys are that old enough to remember that. And then certainly cloud computing and some of the development stacks that have been out there over the years. And the reason they're doing that is because they're looking to sell a product or, something that has substance or visibility into the marketplace, which is easier to sell than services. So I noticed in working with different consulting organizations, when they built something like this, they were pitching it, they were selling it. And the concern to me as an architect was it's certainly going to have some applications in very narrow use cases where that stack is going to be applicable and optimized for that stack. But in many cases, it's going to be a misdirection for many of these enterprises. And they're going to take this technology stack or take this framework and force fit it into a problem domain, which means it's going to be extremely inefficient and you're going to overpay and over engineer those problems in many instances. Obviously very technical, kind of issues that you're considering here, but I see that as a bit of a dangerous thing. If people are out there pushing a particular singular technology pattern, framework, technology stack, in all problems, when that's illogical, it's going to end up in a very inefficient state. If you think about it, we did this 10 years ago and still doing this today in many instances with cloud computing. We push technology, in this case, cloud computing technology, in different applications and different use cases. And we had stacks that we were pushing, financial analysis stack, things like that the cloud providers were selling. And the enterprises bought them because they figured it was going to be the path of least resistance to get to a cloud project. And now in many cases, they're hitting the reset button on those and they're moving those back to on-prem because the cloud stack that they were sold, 10 years ago, whatever, turned out to be, just a huge pig in terms of eating money. And now, they're paying $1 million a month, to run, some of these systems, and overpaying in many instances, and they're moving it back to on-prem, and they're paying like $100,000 a month for the same thing. And we're seeing, lots of case studies about this right now. If you get on my other channel, Cloud Computing Insider, I talk a lot about repatriation case studies and why people are doing it. And really, it's fixing architectural mistakes that were made many years ago around typically enterprises being promised and oversold, the value of technology, the speed to get these things deployed in the cloud, and ended up not paying dividends. And I think we're seeing the same thing right now with AI and the agentic and generative AI spaces specifically. So next would be ride the wave through presentations, media appearances, industry panels, amplifying your own narrative while downplaying real-world challenges. We're seeing this in terms of, some of the AI forums that are going on these days, typically sponsored by the big consulting organizations, because they're able to do it. They're able to spend money and, get a venue space and things like that, and have lots of their clients or lots of, people who are working on the technology come and speak about the value of the technology, in kind of a, little pep rally around agentic or generative, what have you. And that's fine. That's their marketing. However, I do have an issue if they're downplaying many of the real world challenges and not talking about the downsides of using the technology when it's going to be effective, when it's not. Almost never do you go to an AI conference and hear about when AI should not be used, which should be a core topic, because in many cases, AI is going to be over engineering and overspending in solving the same problems. And I think it's important that we have people who are speaking in a contrarian tone, which is what I do typically. I certainly look at AI as a force multiplier for the business, and if it's used correctly, it can have tremendous amount of benefits. Always said that. However, it can be a huge hindrance in the business if it's used in the wrong way or it's used for the wrong problem domain. So we're seeing that happening today. In other words, people are applying it everywhere, certainly the agentic stuff. They're overspending on building these architectures, and that's eventually going to bite them in the butt, because later down the line, a few years down the line, suddenly they'll realize that, well, this system is costing me 10 times the amount of money it should be costing me. And by the way, it's not returning any business value because of that. And they have to end up fixing it after the fact, the repatriation thing we talked about earlier. I think there's a lot of that, kind of damage being done these days. In many instances, it's being done because they're getting together and convincing each other that it's always going to be the way to go, where that's not going to be the case, or it's going to be used in a certain way. With a certain, huge amount of technology stacks, huge amount of money, using GPUs for everything, things like that. Well, that's not necessarily going to be needed. And you got to remember the vast number of AI systems out there that are going to add value to the business are going to be small language models, which are going to be, very tactically deployed, very easy to build. You're going to take, typically less than 3 months to get it up and running. And they're not going to need massive amounts of GPUs. If they need GPUs at all, many of these things can run on CPUs. We're over-engineering this stuff, overspending on this stuff. And I understand that there's a lot of marketing dollars that are way, bigger than me talking on this podcast. But we really have to get aligned to a sanity here, because ultimately I think this is heading for a huge bubble within the enterprises that are leveraging them, and they're going to end up losing out. And I think in many cases, it's going to damage the business tremendously because of the overspending, the overdependence on this technology, when it's perfectly fine technology to be applied in certain spaces and certain problems, but it's not applicable everywhere. And I think everybody is just overusing it right now. I'm talking about the generative and agentic-based frameworks that are out there. And the other fun thing is not all of these waves of technology hype, pan out. And so if they don't, they swiftly and silently pivot away from technology once the hype subsides, erasing or minimizing, historical association, much like with the past, revolutions such as the metaverse and blockchain. And we saw that happen over the years. Back in the olden days, it was push technology, which everybody was, coming out when the internet came out as, being the next, the next wave of the internet. It turned out to be nothing. And then we saw this most recently with the metaverse, from a few years ago. Everybody was moving quickly into the metaverse, or big consulting firms were building metaverse practices. They were making huge amounts of investment in the metaverse and systems in the metaverse, when you knew that once you got this stuff to the enterprises, they're not interested in creating a virtual world to run their business. It was cool. And, I had the Oculus glasses just like, everyone else. By the way, they gave me a headache. But there was nothing of business value there. It was fun, but it was definitely, built for gaming. We're still using it for gaming these days, but there was nothing that was going to provide an advantage. So the wave of the metaverse, as far as bringing value to many of these enterprises out there, was just a flash in the pan, and people realized pretty quickly that there was nothing there. And so many of the consulting firms that have built practices on the metaverse and huge amounts of white papers and everything we just talked about, surveys on the adoption of the metaverse and things like that. And by the way, it's a good use case for seeing, how well the hype and the marketing can generate interest in something when there's nothing there in terms of value. And I think in many cases, we showed that with the metaverse, hype that was around, and it went nowhere. And you don't see metaverse practices these days. No one's talking about it these days. And the rise of AI just completely, blew it away. Well, that's a concern when we're convinced enterprises to move in that direction and to make investments in that direction. Many enterprises did and ended up not paying out. So in other words, a risk, it was a failure. Of course, we're always taught to fail fast and keep trying stuff, things like that. Nothing against that, but there's certain things that are more obvious than others which shouldn't even be tried. And that was one of them. The next was blockchain. Obviously, blockchain has a huge amount of tactical value, in terms of its use. It becomes kind of a core, mechanism that you can deploy in building a system, but it's not a revolution or in the way in which we're going to deploy, distributed systems, using, accounting-based frameworks, things like that. And that's what blockchain brings. So it's still out there today and still serving value. But as far as having these blockchain conferences that we used to have and this focus on blockchain really kind of as a core innovative differentiator, that was all money that was wasted. And so it's a good tactical deployment. That's all it is. And people are using it like that. And another one would be 5G. And you say, well, Dave, 5G was a big deal. Yeah, but I think everybody put too many eggs in that basket. They were creating, 5G practices and, looking at it as a game-changing technology. And, I did an interview, I think 5 years ago or something about, the rise of 5G and its effect on cloud computing. And they were taken back by the fact I said, really didn't see it as that much of a revolution. I saw it as an innovation. We certainly get to better security frameworks and certainly faster speeds. And we're able to do things wirelessly we weren't able to do a few years ago. But at the end of the day, it's a network improvement. It's not an improvement on infrastructure and how we leverage technology. And people were just putting too much emphasis on what 5G was. Made a lot of people mad, but that was okay. And of course, turned out that I was right because, here we are in 2025. 5G's there. It adds value. I use it every day. I'm sure you guys use it every day as well, but it hasn't revolutionized the way that enterprises deploy and leverage network technology. It's an evolution. If anything, it's a good evolution, but we were making too big of a deal of it, just like we were making too big of a deal of the metaverse and too big a deal of blockchain. Now, I wasn't one of them doing that, but we're seeing other instances of that are occurring these days. I think agentic AI is going to follow, kind of that framework. Again, it doesn't mean it doesn't have value. Agentic AI, and I've been doing agentic AI-based systems for a long time, is a good architectural deployment pattern that you're able to leverage when it's needed, but it's not necessarily going to be needed each and every time. It should be used sparingly because normally it's very expensive. It's widely distributed, therefore it can have reliability and resilience issues. I'm getting in some, geeky architectural stuff right now, but this is all applicable. And I think people in many cases are overusing it, and we may see a bit of a hangover from that. Probably in 2026 and 2027, when it'll come out that the promises of agentic AI, never really delivered. And it wasn't the promises around the use of agentic AI. It wasn't the architecture to blame. It was the fact of the matter is that architecture was misapplied by people. In many cases, the big consulting companies out there. And of course, they got their marching orders from their marketing teams to go off and message something, to sell something, create forums and frameworks and white papers and surveys, to promote the technology like you're seeing these days. When it turned out, it certainly has a use, but it's not going to be a use the way in which they're defining it now. And so that's one of the reasons I created this channel, Dave is not AI, and just to take a look at this stuff with a bit of skepticism. As an AI architect, and I've been doing this stuff since the 80s, this is hard. This is complex stuff. I don't think you can oversimplify this. And I think in many cases, the marketing messages out there are the oversimplification of AI usage, including generative, including agentic. So by leveraging both genuine engagement and strategic manipulation, it's possible to dominate a technology hype cycle, which we're seeing today. You can buy your way into the market. You can buy your way into the hype. If you spend enough money, people are going to pay attention to the marketing dollars that you're pushing out there, at least in the public eye. And so these steps, while not always ethical, have been employed by opportunists seeking to ride the next big wave, regardless of long-term visibility. Although this approach can generate attention and short-term wins, what you're seeing now, it carries a risk of reputation and trust if you overuse or overexpose it. So in the fast-moving world of emerging tech, such as AI, agentic, and generative, perception sometimes matters more than reality. But ultimately, sustainable success belongs to those who can distinguish real innovation from fleeting buzz. And I think I have the ability to do that. Certainly a superpower that I've had for a long period of time is the ability to look at technology at technology's sake and ignore some of the marketing messages around it and see if it's going to have value or not. And in many cases, the technology has value, but I think if we're over applying it or applying it to solve the wrong problems, it's going to come back and backfire. And I think we're going to see some of that occurring in 2026, 2027, around the big AI boom. We're already waiting for the bubble to burst and things like that. Again, AI has huge amounts of power, huge amounts of value that can leverage within the enterprise if it's applied in a purposeful way where it's solving the right issues. But the way in which we're looking at it is kind of a one size fits all kind of way of approaching everything out there, and certainly firing people around using AI and things like that, ahead of any kind of reason to do that. All those mistakes are being made right now, and they're going to be chickens that come home to roost. So don't forget to like, subscribe, and check out my other videos on this channel. Also check out my In for World Cloud Computing blog, my 100+ LinkedIn learning courses, and of course my generative AI architecture course out on Go Cloud Careers. And finally, my latest book, An Insider's Guide to Cloud Computing. So until next week, stay very, very safe. Later.